relatively speaking. You've been able to accomplish a lot of that, understand it. It has to be so different than what you thought you were doing when you got on that plane to go to Seoul, South Korea, all those years ago.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I didn't have any plan back then. I wasn't sure, what I was doing except taking it a day at a time,
Right.
really. But you're right. It has completely shaped. It has that whole experience has shaped who I am as an educator for practical reasons, right? Because my first experience, my first student population, I was working with ESL students, and so there are specific strategies and methodologies that you are taught in order to reach that population. Um, but what I realized when I got back to the States and I started working, even with, in the field, we refer to them as domestic students. So these are students who grew up in the States, right? Um, it's that the methodology and the strategy that worked really well for my Korean college students also worked really well for these students. So it wasn't necessarily the language was a barrier, or that we were making accommodations or adaptations for language. It was that these types of technologies and the types of the scaffolding and the different ways that I'm building out, the curriculum, and the way that I'm adding multimedia, and the way that I'm, making, because with a learner for whom they're trying to process high level content in a foreign language, their cognitive load is going to come on much more quickly than someone who's processing high level content in their native language. Maybe for obvious reasons, maybe not, but you're dealing with an extra set of breaks there. You're dealing with an extra, like, I have to stop, I have to translate, I have to try and pull cultural schema out of my background. I'm doing all of this while trying to process your lecture, and I haven't even gotten to the content of your lecture yet, right? So you think about a domestic student that doesn't need to overcome that language barrier, but they're still dealing with their own, cultural barriers, and they're dealing with just being an adult and having a bad day, and there's a thing called learning styles, which has been debunked a lot. And it's less of a learning style, maybe perhaps more of a learning preference. Some people prefer getting up out of their seat and talking to a partner. Some people prefer watching a video. Some people prefer getting um, information through a podcast or in an audio format, right? And so that's called differentiated learning. And what I noticed, that is a must in an ESL classroom. You can't avoid it. But I also noticed that it's a must in a classroom full of students for whom are fluent native speakers. They also enjoyed having multiple modes of information. They enjoyed having it in text and in audio format, and they enjoyed having the extra videos and the extra graphics and the extra attention to their working memory, and constantly like doing group work versus just sitting and listening to me lecture for hours. And so that was really intriguing to me. I was just like, oh, it turns out that everybody benefits from these types of accommodations. But I think the most important thing that I noticed was that um, it's not necessarily about the quality of the asset that you're creating. So there's something that comes up, I see a lot now in the professional fields that I'm involved in regarding instructional design. And it has to be, you've got to have the best tools, and you've got to have the really advanced technology, and the e-learning has to be so heavily produced, and it's got to have branding and colors and graphics. And um, the students that I have worked with, and in when I and in companies as well. So we're talking about employees and customers and clients who are getting that corporate world. It's it could be a pencil and paper. Honestly, it's not necessarily the quality or the quantity of the tools that they're using and how expensive and great they were. Um, it's about the quality of the design of the experience, right? And so, like I mentioned to you before, having these structures and systems in place. So I come into your classroom every single week. I know exactly what it's going to be like. I know that you're going to spend 5 minutes doing housekeeping, then you're going to give us a form, and that form's going to collect some data from us about any issues that we encountered on the homework the day before, right? And then I know I'm going to go to my group. And then in my group, I'm going to spend 10 minutes teaching are reviewing what we read the night before. And then we're going to shift and we're going to change groups. And I'm going to go to this other group and then we're going to do a teach back where that group teaches me what they learned. And so I'm getting these different perspectives around the same type of content, which is also a really important skill for adults to have, right? Is to be able to see a single resource from 4 different perspectives. That's something that really helps them be successful. So, right. And so you think about that design and all this time we're using board markers and we're using sticky notes and, we're using pencils and paper. And when we look back at the quality of the learning and who scored higher on tests and who scored lower, and maybe even it's just general feedback at the end of the semester that students have to give around, which professor did you like the best? It always came back to the systems and structures and the reliability of those systems and structures and being able to navigate them with success and confidence. And the variability in terms of how the content was presented that they were able to digest and process in a meaningful way. And it's very rarely about how cool my PowerPoint was designed or whether or not they had iPads in the classroom. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think it's interesting that somebody with your background and the work that you've put into it, we talk about all the similarities of the way people learn, whether it's in Korea or in the United States, whether it's in English or in a different language, whether they speak one of those languages and they're learning in a different language. I'm curious, what are some of the differences that you've noticed? I only ask because I think education is kind of treated with broad strokes a lot of the time in our society. People say, this is how you learn. This is how people learn. And, and that very well may be for 80% of it. But if you're, and I'm not talking about designing something, and we'll get to the second act part. It's just, you're talking about some really interesting things. So, when you're designing something, you have those 90th percentile people that you're getting across the finish line. And you have those 40th percentile people that you're getting to the point where they can say they have enough of a working knowledge to carry on. But what are the differences that between the way people learn, between the different things that happen, where you can take somebody in the 60th percentile and bump them to a 90? And how do you identify those and integrate them into a program that still has to look after the 40th percentile and 90th percentile?
Mm-hmm. Honestly, the most effective, well, there's a couple, and this does very much depend on culture. And one thing I learned very quickly is that we tend to identify culture as country-based, language-based, right? That's in the field what we call big C. It's the surface level things, it's the clothes, it's the food, the kind of music that you listen to. But there's a lot of hidden C culture that we don't take into consideration, even when we're designing workspaces or teams, when we're building teams at companies, and we're doing training for in a corporate environment. It's the small C culture, which is, how do you give and receive feedback? How do you negotiate? How do you ask for help? How do you, right? Like, are you comfortable with telling a superior that they've made a mistake? And what is the language and what is the process around doing that? And so that can be very different. In South Korea, for example, it's students won't just, I shouldn't speak generally, but in my experience, they won't just raise their hand and say, I have a question. Because there's very many layers to the culture and reasons why they don't do that. And it's out of respect for the instructor. They don't want to interrupt the instructor, is one really good example. And so I had to build these, I had to design, these different types of feedback mechanisms where we could do anonymous back channeling, right? So for example, you could have a Slack open, or you could have just some sort of a chat space open where people have pseudonyms or they have avatars, or it's not their real name, where they can post a question and it's always projected on the board. And when I have a moment, I'll pivot to it and I'll answer the question, where I'm doing it as to the general classroom, right? So nobody feels called out, nobody feels shame, nobody feels embarrassed. And so having those types of sort of in your back pocket, those alternative ways to make sure that everyone feels safe and everyone is able to be heard, no matter what their normal practice is, or right, like I was saying, like how you give and receive feedback, how you request help. That's a cultural phenomenon or a cultural action that everybody has embedded in them. It doesn't matter where you're from in the world. But another way to help people overcome those things, and also, like you mentioned, pull them out of their comfort zone and into a space where they can grow and develop, is peer-to-peer engagement. I'm very much a socio-constructivist in terms of my pedagogy. I believe that we co-construct knowledge as human beings in social situations, and we learn by doing, and we learn by making mistakes. And there's actually a lot of science out there that is able to pinpoint that we actually learn by forgetting. And then it's in that moment where we forget and we relearn that it sticks, and it sticks, for a really long time. And so that happens when you're in these very natural scenarios, particularly in groups where I'm learning from a peer and that peer is teaching me their perspective. And then I switch and I go to another peer group and I'm getting this peer's perspective. And then all the while I'm negotiating my own perspective, right? And this is all, by the way, anytime you're doing peer to peer, it's low stakes in terms of motivation and cultural comfort versus the hierarchy of me, the instructor, and you having to explain yourself to me and vice versa. There's a power dynamic that takes place there that you eliminate when you just make 80% of your curriculum peer focused. And so that's something that's really worked for me.
Has there been, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but has there been something either that you learned in Korea that you brought back to the US that wasn't quite as widespread or widely used, or something that you learned in the US that you took to Korea that really worked well, and just because of the big C culture, without that interaction of that educator, that facilitator that was familiar with both, that you found big success going, like the Slack channel, like maybe in I don't know, in a country where they don't use a message, an IM system like that. Was there one thing where you went, without all of this experience, I might have never tried that, and look at the results that I'm experiencing because of it?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's I'm sure there are a million of them. I'm not sure that I can pull one out right now. I mean, one thing that just sort of came to mind when you were asking the question was something that, and this became very apparent when we had to switch to online learning because of COVID, right? Is body language. So people who are used to leading teams, and that's very much what a teacher is, an educator, a facilitator. We're leading teams of people, right? In that face-to-face environment, you get very dependent, almost codependent on body language, reading body language. I think you and I talked about that before we started the call, right? Being able to see my facial expressions, see when I'm lighting up, and know when to hone in on a specific topic.
Right.
Body language doesn't always translate. It's right. And so I know certainly going back to South Korea the second time, because at that point I had come back, I'd gotten my master's of education, and I went to Korea this time knowing that I was going there to be an educator and knowing what I wanted to do. Um, body language. So for example, in South Korean culture, you never look your teacher in the eye when you're talking to them. You never look your boss in the eye. So anybody who socially or functionally would just sit a little bit higher up than you on the social hierarchy, you just don't look them in the eye. It's disrespectful to do that. And so that is something in American culture, or at least I would say North American culture, that is very much. I've worked with pre-service teachers at my university in Pittsburgh who were fresh out of high school. They're getting their bachelor's in education. They're so excited. They can't wait to get into the classroom and be a teacher. And, one of the things that they would do student teaching, and then they would come back and say to me is, well, these students don't look me in the eye when I'm talking to them. And it's so disrespectful. And I'm not sure how to navigate it. Right. And so that's, again, another cultural thing. And it's something I've seen people struggle with all the time. It's like, I thought I understood culture because I respect their language and I respect their clothes and I respect their food. But, it's that small C culture. And I would say that has been just in terms of not only like an internet person, someone who's worked internationally, but just navigating even family, friends, as now a business owner and somebody that has to have, I'm on calls with people all the time I've never met before, total strangers. Um, I would just say that that's something that I always keep in my back pocket is trying to be descriptive rather than judgmental of your engagements with folks and really breaking down why might this behavior be occurring, and it likely has nothing to do with me.
So you've got this plethora of experience. You're out in the world, you're educating, you're playing by the rules ish. You've kind of, whether your path was directly there, um, and whose really is, but you've got here. And one day, maybe not one day, over a period of time, you come to the realization that your cup isn't full. You're not getting all that you need out of this. And I mean, you have a PhD. You're an adjunct professor. By any kind of measure, the success has come from the hard work. But you decide that you want to do something on your own. You just alluded to the fact that you're running your own business, and you decided to make a change, but you stay within education. Do you want to tell us about that change and what you've set out to do?
Yeah. So I was also freelancing a bit in the corporate world while I was finishing up my doctorate. So I'd gotten a taste of that as well. So I'd had sort of a foot in academia, which I'd had for many, many years. And then I also sort of had a foot in this corporate world. And it was in that world that I saw an opportunity to make real change. Right. Because I think in the K through 12 space, or maybe even in the academic space, anytime you slap the word academic on something, we take it very seriously. We're using learning outcomes, we're using frameworks, we're using theory, we're using science. This must be very serious. But in the corporate world, or maybe even even if it's a small business, it doesn't matter. Just outside of traditional learning space, we tend to not take learning that seriously. It's just assumed that, oh, well, this isn't a school, this is work. You're just, we're teaching you how to sell this new product, right? So that you make money and we make money. And it's just assumed that environment shouldn't be taken as seriously as a proper training or school scenario. And so what I started noticing time and time again is that it was just like, just slap it into a PowerPoint, just slap it on a PDF. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's not a big deal. And I just was like, but it is a big deal. you know, it
I
is.
know this. I know this for
Yeah.
a fact. It is a big deal.
It is a big deal because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if there is this sort of misconception that if it's not high stakes, right? If no one's going to lose their job because they didn't score well on this test, then we shouldn't use learning science to design it. And we shouldn't use multimedia principles to design it. And we shouldn't worry about motivation. And we shouldn't worry about cognitive load. And we certainly shouldn't worry about, um, you know, those kinds of peer dynamics, like I mentioned. And do people feel safe asking questions? And do people feel that they have a space where they can give feedback, in a descriptive and non-judgmental way? So all of those principles that I just spent all the time talking about in those types of adult training environments that are, quote unquote, just for work, they just get tossed out, and they're not respected and they're not applied. And I kept coming up against walls again and again and again where, I would say I would be given a task to do. They would say, okay, you're going to create a training for a solutions deployment program. So their job is to sell a product, or sorry, their job is to go into a client who's just purchased one of our products and integrate and install it for them, get them up and running, and then leave, right? And so that's a skill that people need to be trained in how to do. But when I would say, okay, so let's start with learning outcomes, right? So what are the 6 things that we need them to take away from this training, or we'll consider the training a fail? And I would get, who cares? Just put some stuff on a PowerPoint. It's just They need to do their job. Okay, well, what is their job? Can you give me 4 bullet points that would describe what their job is? Yeah, they do stuff and things and they do it well, and I'm being a little pedantic, but I just was like, no,